Be seated. There are moments that the Gospel of Luke feels almost cinematic. The Gospel writer paints beautiful images while being really particular about setting the scene. And I think that if the author of Luke were to be shown what a movie theater is, that he would, after he got over his initial shock of moving pictures and recorded sound, get right to work on creating the definitive film adaptation of his already cinematic gospel. Today's scene would begin with a wide shot, and however wide you might be imagining, it's not nearly wide enough for the shot that this scene begins with. It opens with a view of the entire Milky Way galaxy, and with quick speed begins to zoom in on our corner of the galaxy, and then in onto our solar system, in onto that pale blue dot in the sea of black that we call home. Shot continues to zoom in until we find ourselves looking in on Mary, sitting in her home, in a town that is insignificant even by local standards, let alone the cosmic standards that the scene sets. And we see her meeting the angel Gabriel, who appears as if he would be more at home in that first shot, surrounded by stars and planets, than in this small house in a backwater town. Something in the way that all of this is framed makes the meeting seem more than a little bit odd. The underlying grandeur of the moment is totally incongruous with the setting. When we're asked to think about God's mighty works, it's easy to jump right to the big and flashy stuff. The things that happened on a grand, one might even say biblical scale. Events like the creation of the universe from nothing, the Exodus and the parting of the Red Sea, the birth of Jesus with all of the attendant choirs of angels, gathered shepherds, and late arriving magi, or the events of Holy Week and the resurrection at Easter. These stories have a tendency to stick in our minds, and that's for good reason. They are as profound and important as they are loud and flashy. But given all of those things, it would be easy to start thinking that this pattern that is sketched out is just part of God's MO, that God prefers to act on this grand scale, accompanied by a professional choir of angels and archangels. But thinking that would miss a tremendous part of the story. If all we looked for were the big, grand moments, we would miss John the Baptist leaping in Elizabeth's womb upon encountering Jesus for the first time. We would miss Jesus quietly sneaking off for some time alone in prayer. And we would miss Mary, a young woman from a nowhere village in a Judean backwater, being visited by Gabriel with news from God. We would miss the power of God acting in a way and in a place that seems incongruous with the immensity of what God is doing. What I'm about to say might be dangerous for a member of the clergy to say, given the logistical issues and the strain that all of this puts on flower guilds and altar guilds. But the more I've sat with our weird liturgical timing this Advent, with Advent 4, the fourth Sunday of Advent, sitting in the morning of Christmas Eve, the more I begin to appreciate it and like it. The fourth Sunday of Advent, being the morning of Christmas Eve, forces us to stop for a moment, to take pause before running full tilt to Bethlehem and the exultant angels. It forces us to sit with Mary in her home. Our schedule beautifully juxtaposes the ordinary with the extraordinary. The young nobody encountering the holy with the birth of the Messiah some 9 months later. For all of the grandiosity that is to come this evening, we are reminded this morning of this humble starting point. We are reminded that God's MO tends to look far less like visible choirs of angels overhead and far more like that short conversation that Mary had with Gabriel. And God has made a habit of reaching out in amazing ways to those who society would least expect. Time and time again, God has reached out and acted to and through the least of these, rather than those who occupy places of honor and power. By the end of 1914, Europe was already ravaged by a war that had started just a few short months before. And in those months, the fighting at the Western Front had come to a brutal standstill. By that December, French and British soldiers sat in cold, muddy trenches across from their German counterparts who enjoyed similar accommodations. They sat across a bombed-out no-man's land that laid between them. Already, these short 4 months into the war, progress would have been more realistically measured in inches rather than miles, if one were able to measure it at all. And one can easily imagine that for those unlucky enough to have been in those trenches, the whole ordeal might have seemed nothing short of pointless and hopeless. It was a life made up of hours, filled with equal parts monotony and terror that stretched into days, that stretched into weeks. But in the week leading up to Christmas, something incredible began to happen. Up and down the trenches, groups of people, Germans, Brits, and French, began to put down their guns and to gather in that bombed-out no-man's land between them to exchange greetings and gifts with one another. In one notable occurrence, a soccer ball was found, and the soldiers put down their guns and picked up the ball. And for just a moment, the joy of playing a game replaced the grim realities of war. The sound of gunshots and grenades was replaced by the sound of laughter and of Christmas carols sung in at least 3 languages. In this bleakest of places, God entered into the lives of those who were hurting, who were poor, who were frightened. Into all of the pain and horror, hope found a way to break in. In this most unlikely of places, God made God's self present. Over the last weeks, we've heard calls to be awake, to pay attention, and to patiently await the coming of God into our lives. And tonight, we will celebrate with great pomp and with great joy the arrival of Jesus in both great humility and in great majesty. But this morning, where we're not quite there yet, we're reminded to look for God where we least expect. To look for God in moments that seem too painful or broken or unimportant for God to show up. Because, my friends, it is in those moments that God tends to break in and to begin the work of remaking and reorienting this hurting world.